Hi, I just discovered this new author and I want to check out his books. Oops. His name is Karlfried Graf von Durkheim. And this book is called The Way of Transformation: Daily Life as Spiritual Exercise. This is like an introduction. It's called Everyday Life as Practice. It is a truism that all work, all art, and all professional activity require practice if they are to succeed. This we accept, and in order that we may establish ourselves in the world, it is obvious that we must be at pains in all our vocations, avocations, and transactions to practice and assimilate experience. We do not sufficiently realize, however, that the success of man's most important task, infinitely more essential than any of his arts or professions, also depends upon practice. This destiny of everything that lives is that it should unfold its own nature to its maximum possibility. Man is no exception, but he cannot, as a tree or a flower does, fulfill his destiny automatically. He is only permitted to become fully what he is intended to be when he takes himself in hand, works on himself, and practices ceaselessly to reach perfection. Here we must ask ourselves the question, what is man's most important task? It is none other than himself, the making of himself into a true man. The reader may well ask, what purpose do study, practice, and collecting and assimilation of experience serve when one is oneself the task in hand? What steps are necessary in order to achieve this? What kind of experiences need to be thought of as essential and therefore to be integrated? In what does practice consist? What are the prerequisites of success? Let us first consider what we conceive of as a worldly task. It is evident that the prerequisites for this to succeed are a mind completely at the service of the work in hand, a tenacious will, the capacity to assimilate the necessary experience, the efficient development of relevant talents and their proper techniques, and, in addition to all this, the ability to achieve a continuous adaptation to the exterior world. As a result of such labors, it is possible for man to bring to fruition that mastery through which worldly success is assured. However, our inner task, if it is to prosper, must be the fruit of a human being's complete maturity in all its aspects. And the prerequisites of maturity consist first in the breaking down of the small I. That is to say, the I that rejects pain is full of fears and is solely concerned with the things of the world. Then must come the perception, the acceptance and unfolding of our inborn, transcendental essence, and, together with all this, the relinquishing of standpoints and positions which obstruct it. There must be an attitude of earnest acquiescence to such experiences as will lead to its perception, the attainment of a personal posture which corresponds to the inner essence, and, throughout this difficult work, an absolute devotion to one's progress along the inner way. By this means, a man is led towards inner mastery. An all-encompassing attitude will thus have been achieved, which will enable the process of inner growth and ripening to continue. Such a life attitude is the only one by which a man may fulfill his own law and destiny, which is to become a person, a human being, who is at once transparent to the divine being within him and able to express it in his life, in the world. Our inner task, unlike our work in the world, does not revolve around eternal aptitudes, but has, as its focal point, the transformation of the being of man into an expression of divine being. If and when it happens that the inner task prospers, it must not therefore be assumed that a man knows or possesses more than before. What happens is that he is more. A change has taken place. Behind the worldly achievements visible to any observer, there is the inwardly transformed man who, very possibly, may be visible to nobody. But just as all valid capability in the world requires a certain level of human development, so also does the transformation which leads to inner maturity, required that a man should consciously and responsibly labor at the tasks set by the world. Inner and outer work are not mutually exclusive. On the contrary, we are invaded, as it were, from morning to night, both by our inner being as well as by the threatening exterior world for which we are responsible. The field of our ceaseless effort to reconcile both sides is none other than our ordinary daily life. Our achievements in the world may be said to be perfect only insofar as they consummate and realize the idea that is their inner meaning, whether it be a work of art or a system of philosophy, the building of a house or the setting up of some organization, factory or technical apparatus. It possesses a valid form, Guldridge Gestalt, only when each of its parts accomplishes the underlying purpose of the whole. The same applies to the inner task. Man himself is one of life's forms, or Lebensgestalt, but he, too, is valid and can endure only insofar as he fulfills as a whole, and in the unifying of all his forces, what he is fundamentally intended to be. But what is man? What is he intended to be? Intrinsically, that is to say, in his essence, man is an aspect of divine being whose purpose is to manifest itself in him and through him. Just as flowers and animals in their own way reveal divine being, so also must man reveal it in the way of man. He can only be right when his life form, with all its forces, fulfills the destiny that dwells within him as his existential being. For each of us, our essential being is the medium through which we participate in divine being. It may also be said to be the means by which divine being strives through us to manifest itself in the world, not as something apart from the world, a mere spiritual inwardness, but as a bodily presence. It follows that our human inner growth is necessarily accomplished within the framework of our worldly destiny, in the midst of ordinary life and the carrying out of daily tasks. Man's destiny is to bear witness, in his own special way, to divine being, which is to say, consciously and freely. Flowers and animals fulfill theirs of necessity and unconsciously, limited only by whatever external conditions may hinder them from becoming what, in their essence, they are. Man, however, unlike flowers and animals, has been endowed with consciousness, and it is by means of this quality that, as an eye, he is able to stand and confront the world. Because of this, he becomes, at least to some extent, independent and therefore responsible for his own development. Herein lies his great chance, but here, too, let us not forget, lies danger. For between this chance and this danger he may miss the mark. The oneness of that life, which is beyond space and time, breaks apart in man's ego consciousness into two poles. One, the historical world, which, being subject to laws of space and time, can be understood and mastered, and two, transcendental being, which, cannot be encompassed by space and time, and is beyond all ordinary understanding. Thus, inevitably, man experiences himself as a being standing between heaven and earth. He lives in a state of tension between two realities: the world, which confines him to latitude, longitude, and duration, endangers his existence, tempts him with hopes of happiness, and demands his obedience to its laws, and the supernatural state of being hidden within him and towards which, even unknowingly, he yearns. Ceaselessly striving to find the light, this being calls him forth beyond the laws and boundaries of his little personal life to the surface of greater life. It is essential that each person, in order to be able to endure his fate in the world and to master this, his own life, should amass knowledge of himself and of the way he exists as a temporal being. To become a whole man, however, he must also come to have knowledge of the one he is in his divine presence, in example, of his essential being, whose needs must also be satisfied. Only when he has acquired this knowledge will he be free to satisfy the demands of his inner being. However, the law of his development is such that, in the beginning, it is predominantly the consciousness which serves to establish his place in the world and is unfolded. This one-sided view of the world, which is dominated by the will to survive and the wish that life should have meaning and provide satisfaction, veils the divine being present in his own essential being. Thus, man readily loses sight of the deeper significance of his existence, which is, in effect, to manifest divine being within his life, this life. Ultimately, however, he cannot escape from the fact that his wholeness and welfare depend on his fulfilling his inner mission and living from his essence. If consciously or unconsciously, he concerns himself solely with his work in the world and exercises and establishes his world ego alone, he is bound in the end to fall prey to a specifically human unhappiness. And this happens whether or not his personal virtues and achievements correspond to the values of and expectations of the world. The more man has succeeded in adapting himself to the world by mastering external life, and the more he assumes himself to be living blamelessly, the less he is able to understand the inevitable and, to him, inexplicable suffering which is brought about by his estrangement from his inner essence. This suffering, coming as it does from his still unfulfilled inner being, is of a quality quite different from any unhappiness the eye may experience in the world. Only that pain which arises from the depths of himself can finally compel a man to look inwards and bring him to the realization that he has lost touch with his own essential inner being. In such a condition, he may perhaps recall times when he sensed something beckoning to him from within and turned his back upon it, moments when conscience summoned him, and he was not able to listen. Thus, he is faced with a decision, either to stifle the inner voice once again and continue in his old ways, or to make a new start based on what he has learned from within. Once, however, a man has so awakened to his essential being that he can no longer ignore its claims, his life, from that moment, is governed by a new and continuous state of tension. Inevitably now, he will be oppressed by the contradiction between the needs, duties, and temptations of the world and the call of his inner nature. On the one hand, the world will continue to exact its requirements without reference to the inner voice, and, on the other, without reference to the world's voice, inner being will make its insistent demand. Thus, we are torn between the two aspects of our human existence, and yet our life in the world, as well as our participation in transcendental being, are but two poles of the one self that is ever striving within us towards realization. It is through the development of this self that the oneness of life is realized in the human form. And given these conditions, if we are upright within it, will inevitably mean that we are upright without. For this reason, it is essential to discover in ourselves an attitude, even a physical posture in which we can be open and submissive to the demands of our inner being, while at the same time allowing this inner being to become visible and effective in the midst of our life in the world. And for this to happen, we must so transform our ordinary life, daily life, and every action is an opportunity for inner work. Our very efforts towards worldly efficiency may, under these conditions, become the means of inner practice, or exercitium, exercises. The purpose of all living things, man among them, is to manifest the divine in the world. Man's distinctive virtue lies in the fact that the great, the divine life, becomes in him, conscious of itself. In the freedom of conscious life, as opposed to mechanical life, the divine can shine forth and take form. Therefore, the true man is he who, in freedom and with clear awareness, embodies and reveals the divine being within himself. The vividness of his inner life, the radiance of his being, and the benign effect of his actions will all give evidence of his inner state. Such a state enables divine being in all its plenitude, inner order, and unity to appear. It does not, however, develop along a straight line, for it must first pass through a stage of existence in which the I is determined solely by the world, thus preventing a man's awareness of his essential being. This so-called natural manner of existing, whose center of consciousness is the worldly ego, must of necessity be broken down, for this ego is not concerned with the need to ripen in accordance with inner being, but is solely preoccupied with maintaining its secure position and competent functioning in the world. Man survives in the world by means of a certain kind of consciousness which, by its crystallized concepts, organizes life into a succession of rigid structures. Through these, he perceives the world rationally, masters it systematically, and orders it according to fixed values. It is just this form of existence that veils his awareness of divine being. At the center of this way of life stands the ego, which, by its very nature, is solely occupied in establishing and classifying facts, and around it revolve continually its own worldly desires. By means of this ego, man separates himself from his unconscious connection with the oneness of life, and assumes in the world an attitude of independence and self-assertion. As long as the ego takes up uncompromising attitudes and irre- irrevocably irrevocably fixed points of view, so will the oneness of life break up into the opposites of I, world, or world I, and the essential being. The ego's separation from the primal core of life and its determined orientation towards the world bring all growth, all true becoming, all transformation to a disastrous standstill. It is true that man has need of an ego that is capable of objectively mastering the world, but only when he succeeds in evolving a form of existence in which his world ego is sustained, though in such a way that um, it remains at the same time transparent to divine being within him, can he become a true man, person in the ultimate sense, through whose life, greater life, um, resounds. Personare, or equals to sound through. To attain this state of mind requires ceaseless practice. In other words, every passing moment of the day round must be used as an opportunity for such practice. When one speaks of the daily round, the phrase carries overtones of meaning and experience which distinguish it from the holiday. Compared with a holiday, the ordinary day may appear monotonous and gray. It is dull, in the sense that one is used to it. The common round of activities always has an unchanging sameness. By this endless repetition, the normal day threatens to mechanize us. It is a treadmill of repeated movements and actions, whereas the holiday stands for something unique, joyous, unusual. The ordinary day deadens, whereas the holiday refreshes. If one contrasts the freedom Sunday brings us, the ordinary day feels constrained and rigid. It stands for labor, for a round of doing, in contrast to the leisure promised by Sunday. Its sobriety is far from the festivity which a holiday brings. The ordinary day devours us. On holiday, we find ourselves again. The ordinary day draws us outwards. Sunday enables us to be inwardly free. The ordinary day is ruled by the overbearing world which compels us to be efficient machines. But Sunday belongs to our inner, non-mechanical selves. Need this be so? It must be so, alas, as long as man is engulfed by his world ego, and so engrossed by worldly undertakings that they completely overshadow his inward self. There is, however, a way out. He needs just a single moment of insight, a flash of understanding of our situation to make everything change. Such a moment, such a flash, will light up not only our inner actions, particularly those most repetitive and familiar, but our inner experience as well. It is proverbial that in whatever we do, we assume a certain attitude. What we do belongs to the world. In the how, the way we do it, we infallibly reveal ourselves whether our attitude is right or wrong, in harmony with the inner law, or in contradiction to it, in accordance with our right form, or opposed to it, open to divine being, or closed to it. And here we must pose the question: what is our right form? It is none other than that in which we are transparent to divine being. And to be transparent means that we are able to experience divine being in ourselves and to reveal it in the world. Let us suppose, for instance, that a letter has to be posted in a pillar box 100 yards away. If the mouth of the pillar box is all we see in the mind's eye, then the 100 strides we take towards it are wasted. But if a man is on the way as a human being and filled with a sense of all that this implies, then even this short walk, providing he maintains the right attitude and posture, can serve to put him to rights and renew himself from the well of inner essence. The same can be true of any daily activity. The more we have mastered some relevant technique, and the smaller the amount of attention needed to perform the task satisfactorily, the more easily may the emphasis be transferred from the exterior to the interior, whether in the kitchen or working at an assembly belt, at the typewriter, or in the garden, talking, writing, sitting, walking, or standing, dealing with some daily occurrence, or conversing with someone dear to us, whatever it may be. We can approach it from within and use it as an opportunity for the practice of becoming a true man. Naturally, this is possible only when we are able to grasp the real meaning of life and become responsible towards it. It is essential to realize that man is not committed merely to comprehending and mastering the external world. He is, first and foremost, committed to the inner way. When this is understood, the truth of the old Japanese adage becomes clear. For something to acquire religious significance, two conditions alone are necessary. It must be simple and it must be repetitive. Note, see Durkheim, Die Geistige Überwindung des Mechanischen in Durchbruch zum Westbrook. Okay, it's a book. What does this word repetitive signify here? It can happen that daily tasks, by their very familiarity, serve to free us from the grip of the ego and its quenchless thirst for success. They can also help to make us independent of the world's approval and open for us the inward way. But this is true not only of familiar tasks. Even the practice and repeated effort needed to master something new can be put to the service of the inner work. In everything one does, it is possible to foster and maintain a state of being which reflects our true destiny. When this possibility is actualized, the ordinary day is no longer ordinary. It can even become an adventure of the spirit. In such a case, the eternal repetitions in the exterior world are transformed into an endless flowing and circulating inner fountain. Indeed, once repetition is established, it will be found that our very habits can be the occasion for inner work. They enable us to make new discoveries and show us that even from the most mechanical actions, there may issue forth that creative power which transforms man from within. By dwelling exclusively in this world consciousness, which develops out of and lives by crystallized concepts and values, a man loses touch with transcendental being. But in his essential being, he is and forever remains a mode of this being. Without ceasing, it strives to manifest itself in and through men as a threefold process, as plenitude, bringing joy, as order, bringing meaning, as oneness, manifesting itself through love. All three being invulnerable to the world. Thus, one becomes aware that being, with its divine force present and alive in our essence, is the result neither of wishful thinking nor of religious belief, but is the most real of all realities. Only for the man who is entrenched in his worldly positions, rational concepts, and rigid habits does being remain an abstract idea. For him who has lost touch with the core of life, it is, at most, a subject for metaphysical speculation or pious credulity. But for one who breaks through the mist of rationalization, it becomes personal experience. All religions, concepts, and images are, in their original meaning, interpretations of this deepest of all experiences. When, however, religion is allowed to become a system of rigid, ordered principles and dogmas, in example, forced into the confines of a doctrine that is required to be believed, it blocks the possibility of vitally experiencing divine being. Or alternatively, it tries to debase it by labeling it as a merely subjective experience. But what does such a phrase connote? In point of fact, it means the existential truth of man as an experiencing and suffering subject. And to this condition, he is brought solely through this so-called merely subjective inner experience. The time has come for man to free himself from the idea that only those things which can be rationally grasped and objectively verified are real and binding. With regard to questions of being and the meaning of life, he needs to recognize the primal validity of the inner experience, which, beyond all doubt and with unequivocal clarity, when it arises within him, brings joy, a sense of responsibility and transformation. The undeniable inner experience is the one thing that can truly touch, move, and compel us to follow it. And only by completely experiencing divine being can we come to realize that the whole content of the world, as we see it, is itself nothing other than that being. But for us, that being is clouded. We perceive it through the refracting and distorting prism of the ego. That ego which, being externally orientated, inevitably pins down and classifies everything it observes or experiences in terms of objects and of opposites. Such a rational ego view inevitably has the effect of solidifying our consciousness so that we take as real only that which fits conveniently into its preconceived scheme of things. Under such conditions, man loses awareness of his contact with being. The only reality he believes in is the one he intellectually understands, that in which life, under the fixed gaze of his ego, appears to present itself to him. The more man has shut himself off from divine being by this attitude, the more is his own inner essence repressed, that inner essence which is our only approach to the revelation of divine being. It is the suffering which comes from such repression that makes us ready to give proper weight to those rare moments in which divine being blazes up within us, bestowing joy, giving us a sense of freedom and calling us to serve its purpose. But man will only be able truly to value such an experience when he is able to recognize that other suffering which engulfs him, when he allows the world-orientated ego to hide him from true being. Only then will he be able to begin the process of withdrawing his ego to some extent from its world pursuits. Only then will he become open within, free to sense greater life directly, able to hear its voice and thus to transform himself and all that surrounds him or her. The state of mind and body that blocks any awareness of the presence of greater being inevitably produces a special kind of suffering. It is the experiencing of this anguish that forces man to take stock of his life attitudes. This taking stock, if honestly carried out, brings him to so great a pitch of desolation that It forces him to the point where he can perceive, sense, and heed the call of the true essence towards which he now feels himself driven. If, in some propitious hour, he has been given this experience of being, and if, through the failures of his world ego and the suffering that results from them, he has been brought to the great turning point, then, at that moment, he finds himself on the threshold of something new. Now, without fail, he must open himself to the mysterious, numinous content of moods and impulses that he can neither understand nor explain, still less translate into concepts, but in which he can, nevertheless, unmistakably sense something from beyond this world beckoning and calling to him. He must come to realize that through such experiences, divine being, as has already been said, is present in his own being. He must train his faculty of sensory perception to feel and appreciate qualities which are beyond the limits of his ordinary consciousness. His efforts now must be to learn how to enable divine being to enter his own being and remain within him. And in addition, he must strive to reach a state where his transparence to divine being endures, thus enabling him to draw life from greater life, even in his existence as an I, in the little world. To these ends, he needs inevitably to cleanse his unconscious and discard any element, spiritual or physical, that dams up the flow of his essential being. At the same time, he must give entrance to and build upon all that is in harmony with this being. Furthermore, he must practice sustaining this state in his everyday life, and so, in so doing, he will infallibly come to learn that daily life itself is a field of opportunity. There is nothing, no event, no activity that cannot provide a motive for establishing contact with inner being. Nothing that cannot be used to bear witness to it. Any situation in life may be the means of furthering the bringing to birth of the true man. For man is only true when he listens inwardly to being, and at the same time remains in accord with it in his bodily existence in the ordinary world. It is not enough just to turn inwards to experience being solely from within. To express it outwardly is even more important, for it is imperative that man's life in the world as well as in his body should derive from inner essence. Side by side with the rediscovery of man, which is the distinguishing mark of our age, a new consciousness of the body is becoming increasingly evident. The meaning which we give to our body depends on the extent to which we value our human existence. If we measure ourselves solely by our relation to the daily world that continually oppresses and threatens us with its endless requirements, then our body has no meaning except to make our performance and survival in that world physically possible. The whole point of bodily training is thus narrowed down to the development and maintenance of physical efficiency and good health, the sole purpose of which is to function smoothly at its own level. On the other hand, once we understand that the real meaning of human existence is to make manifest in the world the divine being embodied within us, then the true significance of bodily training lies in the need to reach a state that makes such manifestation possible. A man may be at the height of his physical powers, however, and yet not be able to achieve this. His presence may be, as it were, unbecoming. Indeed, his very effectiveness in the world, in a bodily sense, may actually obstruct his essential being. On the other hand, it is possible for a dying man to be physically present in the right way if, serene and trustful, he is able to let go and give himself up, allowing that which is meant by death as transformation to take place. Divine being, since it is beyond both living and dying, is revealed with equal clarity in life as in death. And man, at the moment of death, even in his bodily condition, may become transparent to greater life. It is thus possible to distinguish three different kinds of physical conscience. The demands of the first are orientated towards health, the second towards beauty, and the third towards transparence to greater life. Today, it should be generally recognized that what we call body and psyche are not two separate entities. Rather, they are the two modes by which man, with his rational divided vision, perceives himself. They are the means whereby man as subject realizes and expresses his personal unity. That which is without is within, and that which is within is without. The unity which encompasses and comprehends this antithesis of body and soul is the personal subject. And the only kind of perception with which we can do justice to man as a personal subject is the one that sees him not merely as an objective thing, but by participation in his life, learns to value him as a subject and recognize him as a thou. Here, it is necessary to distinguish between the discriminating what consciousness that is concerned with establishing facts and the understanding who consciousness which alone can reveal personal truth. As subject, we experience ourselves as part of a system which has little relation to the outward world in which all things are rationally ordered and fixed in unchanging positions. From the point of view of this world, we see everything materially as something outside us. We even turn ourselves and other people into objects, into mere pieces of the world. In as far as we see ourselves in this way, we are obliged, as are all things, to fit into and function within rigid, worldly, and, on their own level, valid systems and structures. However, when we relate to life as subject, as thou, we experience and apply towards it a personal point of view, then everything is seen in terms of the life that we ourselves are, that life which, in accordance with its own law, is forever striving towards consciousness, completion, liberation, and fulfillment. In this way, the world resolves itself into the field of our personal life. It becomes the mirror of all our desires, hopes, and fears. Life never stands still. Its order is never rigid, like that of some system established by the world. It is always flexible, always changing, always in the process of becoming. And so it is with man. He is not merely an external form, but a form in time, or Zeitgestalt, and therefore forever in the act of becoming. The driving force behind this transforming process derives not only from the promise of possible realization which lies in man's inmost essence, but also from the anguish which arises when obstructions prevent the fulfillment of this promise. It is promise and pain together that determine the personal nature of the world. If a man is to become a person, however, His inner, mental, spiritual development is not the sole requirement. He needs, too, to develop his body. If we regard and treat the body merely as a thing, a piece of the world, we remain blind to its meaning. Even in his body, man as subject is not a thing, a mere biological organism. But what do we mean by the body of a person? It is the mode in which he, as subject, is visibly present to the world. Taken thus, the body, in a human sense, can only be rightly understood and worked on when we continually bear in mind the person who lives as this body, that person who, as somebody, is always renewing himself, always striving to unfold and to be in the world in accordance with his inner law. Thus, the body is not only something which man has, but the somebody he is in the world. The true man is he who is present in the world in the right way, whether he be dense or transparent, withdrawn into himself or open to life, in form or out of form, centered or without center. He's all these things with his whole being, which is to say also with his body. Any and every gesture of a man reveals him to the world. And it is clear that when a gesture is frequently repeated and becomes more and more habitual, the content it expresses also becomes, for good or ill, more and more crystallized. Thus, the body, in its posture, its patterns or tension and relaxation, in the rhythm of its breathing and manner of its movement, is an infallible indication of the point at which any man has arrived in his way to becoming a person. It may reveal how and where he has stuck fast in his ego and lost himself to the world, or, alternatively, to what extent he has remained open to his being and on the way. Practice on ourselves, in the physical and spiritual sense, is always of two kinds. It involves both the pulling down of everything that stands in the way of our contact with divine being, and the building up of a form which, by remaining accessible to its inner life, preserves this contact and affirms it in every activity in the world. Our union with the divine being, which is endlessly striving towards transformation, is obstructed by everything within us that is in any way rigid. From his earliest years, man develops, according to his degree of consciousness, a way of existing in which, as an I, he is compelled to do consciously and from choice what he can no longer do unconsciously and instinctively. Thus, whenever the world threatens him, does not conform to his ideas, or disappoints him, he begins, even in childhood, to develop patterns of behavior adapted to his surroundings, or passformen. These can help him to survive in situations that may be dangerous, antagonistic, even loveless. But if they become too rigid, they may well obstruct his contact with his inmost being. In such a case, original trust is replaced by a reliance on knowledge, on individual capacity, on possessions, and all their false promise of security. Original faith, which rests on unconscious inner laws and the uninhibited evolution of the inborn image, gives place to reliance on conventional patterns and the effort of keeping up the appearance required by the world. Original union with life is supplanted by dependence on the love and acceptance of others. The still unbroken chains of our childhood, our imprisonment in the superficial social life, our falsely conceived adaptation to the world, and the ceaseless longing of our ego for security, all these have as their result a mixture of prejudices, ready-made formulas of behavior, and grandiose ideas of what we would like to be in the world. If such aspects of ourselves become rigid, as is usually the case, the first thing necessary is that they be recognized and, after that, dissolved. Of course, if this process of inner rigidity has gone too far, an example, has become neurotic, professional help may be needed to effect the dissolution. But the more man himself becomes sensitive to the claims of his essence, and the more ready he is to enter into and accept the truth, the more easily can he, if he is earnestly trying to find himself, recognize the inappropriateness of his one-sided worldly standpoint and become aware of those attitudes that estrange him from divine being. Gradually, under such circumstances, he becomes more and more able to transform himself. And it is his daily life and its practice that gives him this opportunity. One indispensable quality of all practice on the inner way is the presentiment, indeed the experience, of one's own essential being. Without a living contact with this, all practice is bound to go astray and lead into a blind alley. When this happens, we are left to the mercy of the kind of self-discipline that, at the expense of inner truth, seeks health and virtue only in a worldly context. A man who is blind to his own essential being will interpret the suffering which he experiences as an inevitable result of such a condition, as being caused by the world. He may attribute the decline of his efficiency solely to external elements, or feel perhaps that his distress arises as a corollary of some offense he may conceive himself to have committed against the demands of worldly values, religious dogma, or someone in authority. Thus, the very virtues, so-called, of his all too rigid, hapless, worldly ego drive him into still greater alienation from his essence. It cannot be too strongly urged that every attempt to realize the true self is doomed to failure unless the depths within are cleansed first. Only through this contact with his essential being can man become sensitive to what is genuine in him and ascertain what is needful for his self-realization. Only by the experience of his essential being will he come into contact with the divine source of being. And only when this happens is he able to begin the task of creating for himself a form which truly corresponds to his own essential nature and frees him from all falsely conceived methods of adaptation. It would be quite impossible for man to make any statement about the nature of divine being, were it not for indefiable encounters, experiences, and revelations, which in the abundance of their power, significance, and feeling, and in the sense of responsibility they bring, are so utterly different in quality from his usual experience in the world, that he cannot help but see them as manifestations of transcendence. Experiences such as these are only possible when man's hitherto impermeable worldly facade has become porous or, indeed, broken down. It is these experiences which can initiate the opening of the way, or Wende zum Wege. All exercises which serve inner transformation, if they are not the result of mere deference to a barren faith in one or other authority, stand under the sign of such experience. They bring a sense of liberation and responsibility by means of which life is seen to be here and now, and being as inward knowing, or inner sign. Thus, the first and most vital practice in everyday life is to learn effectively to value those moments in which we are touched by something hitherto undreamt of. It can happen that from time to time we are given moments of illumination and decision when something moves and stirs in our inmost depths. When this occurs, we feel bound to keep faith with the experience. We cannot but obey. And this despite, or rather, because what has happened to us is inconceivable. It is, in fact, something which our rational eye cannot really admit. But if we are able at times really to accept it, our fear of annihilation is assuaged. A deep contentment comes upon us. We sense that within us there is something indestructible which, by its plenitude and power, creates a new consciousness of life, and thus our trust is renewed. Or again, there may be occasions when we are thrown into despair by some apparently meaningless paradox in our lives, by the absurd. But if we are able to accept the incomprehensible, it may happen that in the very midst of our lack of understanding, we will sense the situation some deeper within the situation some deeper implication. The reality which we understand with our reasoning mind is suddenly transcended and penetrated by another. The profound meaning of this reality only begins to resound in us when we have come to the end of our rational understanding. Here, at the point where our hitherto impregnable belief in the sense and justice of the world has been shattered, there will dawn for the first time a new, fructifying faith in life and its significance. Or something similar may happen when some blow of fate plunges us into utter desolation. Man is intended to live in dialogue with others. He cannot fulfill his life in isolation. He needs a partner and strives to find shelter in human communion and love. When it happens that life withholds this or deprives him of it, he is driven to an extremity in which he feels he must perish. If now he can bring himself to submit and accept his situation, he has the chance to break through the tension and rigidity with which his enforced loneliness threatens him. If he can now yield trustfully to his inner truth, he may experience the sensation of being caught up and embraced by an unknown power which, at the same time, makes him receptive and open to the whole of life. Although he is forsaken by the world, something from beyond the world makes him feel at one with everything and somehow under the wing of love. Such experiences may become the turning point of our life. They are the means by which our inmost essence can speak to us. When our world ego and its proficiency fails us, that proficiency with which now has seemed to be sufficient for the fulfilling and mastering of life, it is then that the inner voices become audible. It may happen that at the moment when the whole framework of our life is suddenly shattered, the framework which was intended to provide our ego with comfort, meaning, and security, the chance of something new may appear. If a man is now able to accept that which, with his eye alone, he cannot accept, he may quite unexpectedly experience the sensation of being borne up by divine being and filled with a new significance and sense of being converted far beyond the comprehension of his normal consciousness. It is this experience of greater life which makes it possible for us to look death in the face. There are occasions when, without any doubt, we sense this greater life in life, and this can occur a moment after we have been in despair at the thought of life's meaninglessness. Or again, we may suddenly feel at one with all that exists, although we are in fact, in the ordinary world sense, completely forsaken. It is in such moments that the tyranny of our ordinary way of looking at the world is overthrown. These are our auspicious hours. It must be remembered, however, that the power of transformation inherent in such experiences can easily fall into the hands of the devil, who is ever readily and waiting to pounce. It is he who, in the guise of our skepticism, questions the veracity of every experience which cannot be classified and made to fit into our ordinary concepts. But it is not only those periods when fear and despair drive us beyond the limits of our own strength and wisdom that bring us these paradoxical revelations of eternal reality. It is also possible to experience moments of boundless joy, which have a quality of the infinite, and in which the plenitude of divine being seems to draw close to us. This kind of joy, it should be remembered, has no relation to any form of worldly pleasure. However, these radiant, unforgettable, deeply moving, and blessed experiences are not the only ones in which we become aware of that divine being, which is the endless, effluent source of life. There exist also those less outstanding moments and hours in which, quite unexpectedly, we find ourselves in that unique state where divine being may touch us. It may be that all of a sudden we are overwhelmed by an unaccustomed sensation. We seem to be wholly present, completely there, as it were, even though our attention is not directly towards anything in particular. In a strange way, strange because it is so unfamiliar and unexpected, we feel rounded and complete, and at the same time open in a way that allows inner abundance to well up. Although firmly based on the earth, we seem to float on air, at once absent, as it were, and at the same time wholly here. We are full of life, able to rest completely within ourselves and still be closely related to all that is. Apart from everything, and at the same time within everything, bound to all things yet clinging to nothing. In some incomprehensible way, we are guided and yet free, released from objects, aims, and claims. We are poor in the world, yet filled to the brim with inner power and richness. At such moments, we feel penetrated by something that is at once most precious and most fragile. Perhaps that is why, instinctively, we step delicately and do not try to look too closely at what is happening within us. Some ancient knowledge warns us that the warm semi-darkness of an awakened heart, or gemut, is more appropriate here than the cold beam of the rational mind, which freezes every aspect of life. It is as if we heard a voice saying, "See, as if you did not see. Hear, as if you did not hear. Feel, as if you did not feel. Have, as if you had not." But then, alas, this miracle vanishes. Suddenly, it disappears. Indeed, for it is to disappear. One has only to wonder and ask as, what is it? For whatever catches our attention, a thought, an impression, an event, either from without or within, immediately changes our state of consciousness. One moment, it is quiet and calm, receptive and unquestioning, like a chalice open to the pouring in of wine. And the next, it is a sword, sharp and deadly, which pierces the experience and rationally transfixes it. Now the world, which, a second since, was as if enchanted and all of a piece with ourselves, falls again into its usual pattern. How impoverished we feel, Now that we are once again thrown back on our daily selves and are face to face with the ordinary round, the experience vanishes like a dream. And yet, it was certainly not a dream. It was the revelation of the true reality which rose up in us because, for a moment, we were open and free from the fetters of our ordinary consciousness. Through such experiences, we pass beyond this ordinary consciousness to that which is transcendental. No matter how brief the moments of liberation may be, lasting perhaps a fraction of a second, they make us aware, with compelling evidence, of that life which far surpasses our usual I, world, impressions. That life to which in our essence we belong, which in our essence we are, and whose revelation is the goal of all our longing. In order to recognize the reality of this experience of greater being, we need nothing more than the sacred sobriety of common sense. This, in fact, is that transcendental realism. Note: Si Evola, über das Initialische, about initiation, Anatois 6, number 2, 1964. To repeat, this, in fact, is the transcendental realism, which is neither clouded nor inhibited by preconceived concepts and rational thought structures. This sense of reality permits the unique, unclassifiable quality of the experience to be as it is, accepts and savors it, and because of its very incomprehensibility, is intuitively conceived of its truth. We need practice in order to acquire the possibility of recognizing the quality of this reality. By remaining alert and constantly prepared, we can learn to hear and feel the call of the divine being in everything that happens to us. For this, we need to work diligently in order to become vessels capable of receiving all that is poured onto them. And this practice, remember, must not only begin but also end the day. Learn to live each day to its end in such a way that it becomes a part of eternity, as the poet says. Note: C.R. Haldenwang Bons Waldergask Buchhandlung Stuttgart. That's the poet, or the writer. We need a new kind of discipline here, one that aims so to develop our inner experience that it is lifted to a higher level. The results of such discipline come not from the sort of practice that is the mere carrying out of specific exercises, but from one that confirms the old saying, each moment is the best of all each moment is the best of all opportunities. Thus, all things and all events become the field of practice on our journey along the inner way. Moving ever onward and keeping touch with his inmost essence, a man transforms himself, step by step, into a person whose transparence to divine being makes possible the fulfillment of his human destiny. The first condition of all correct practice is that one should understand what that phrase means. It is not the pursuit of such capacities as will fulfill our worldly tasks that is meant here, but rather what may be called exercitium on the inner way, the kind of practice which aims at achieving a specific result in the world comes to an end when that result has been obtained. Inner practice, however, begins only after one has achieved technical mastery in whatever activity it may be, even sport, and consists of endless repetition. Once the technique of some task has been perfected, each repetition of its practice mirrors one's whole inner attitude, Every mistake that is made shows up a fault within ourselves. If this is understood, our efforts to accomplish daily tasks can, at the same time, become inner work in ourselves. Note. See Durkheim, Sportliche Leistung, Achievement in Sport and Maturity, 1966, Frankfurt. In the same way, practice of right posture and rigid breathing can become exercitium, or exercises, only after one has fully mastered the necessary technique. Thus, by means of this continuous repetition, the true inward person begins to emerge. In this way, the ordinary daily round can be transformed into practice. The second condition for this kind of practice, continuous exercitium, is that a man must be resolved and prepared to lead his life in the world in accordance with his inner law, and this means living his life in the service of transcendental reality. He must, at all costs, grasp the truth, which is that only by being faithful and committed to this service can he become whole, or hale, and that as long as he continues to live solely for security and happiness in the world, he will be unable to discover the right way. When all that we know and do becomes a means for the revelation of greater life in the world, then the way may be attained, and the ordinary day itself become one single field of practice. But so long as man tries to gain something solely for himself through this practice, whether it be the acquisition of higher faculties, extraordinary experiences, or tranquility, harmony, even his own salvation, he is bound to miss the way. In all true practice, we are continually preparing ourselves to attain to the position where life, in the service of greater being, becomes second nature. This service will seem onerous as long as we are still cut off from essential being and living solely in our world ego. On the other hand, once a man is really committed to the way, he will shortly have experiences that bring him great joy and a sense of freedom. The inner way, as the practice which enables us to progress along it, has little to do with our usual methods of disciplining ourselves, often against our own nature, to serve unselfishly some worldly cause or community. What is involved here is not merely the discipline by which man masters his instinctive drives and overcomes his nature, nor is it just a matter of acquiring those virtues through which he subjugates his small ego for the sake of the community and his labors in the world. Neither has it anything to do with a personality which loses face when it does not succeed in the world, and is dishonored when it fails to accomplish its tasks or proves to be an unreliable member of the community. All these are steps that necessarily must be taken to the way towards true becoming and maturity. But man can only be said to have really begun his journey on the inner way when the injunctions he blindly obeys are no longer those that conform to the world's scale of values, but rather those which occurred with divine being within him, that being which constantly strives to reveal itself in him and through him into the world. Even the most correct and responsible behavior is unable to satisfy these high demands of it if it is solely the result of an ethical discipline instead of being an expression of man's inner essence. This essence is able to manifest itself freely only when the depths in which it dwells have been cleansed and purified. The most vital element in the practice of the inner way consists in learning to become open and perceptive to the inward experience of essential being. For it is out of essential being that divine being speaks and calls to us. All day we are summoned by the world, which demands that we recognize and master it. At the same time, divine being is perpetually calling us inward. The world requires of us our knowledge and skill, whereas divine being insists that we lay aside knowledge and skill for the sake of inner growth. The world expects us to be continually doing, whereas divine being requires us, quite simply, to allow the right thing to happen. The world tries to keep us on a never-ending treadmill so that we may achieve something that we, in our blindness, consider permanent. Divine being demands that while remaining in touch with it, we refrain, at the same time, from becoming attached to anything at all, even though, in so refraining, we may fear to lose our hold on ourselves. The world encourages us to talk and to do interminably. Divine being requires us that we become quiet and act without acting. The world forces us to concentrate on security. Divine being asks only that we risk ourselves again and again. To the extent that we comprehend it, the world does our bidding. Divine being reveals itself only when we accept the incomprehensible. The power of divine being becomes apparent at the moment when we let go of the things that support us in the world. It is only when we are able to relinquish that which makes us rich in the world that we are enriched and transformed by divine being. Practice in daily life has many aspects. It requires that we make a movement towards the center of our being, and such a movement inevitably involves a complete change of direction in the world. Through practice, we are led to relinquish the world so that our innermost being may reveal itself. But once we have experienced this innermost core and awoken to our essential being, we begin to sense essence in all things. And so, in the midst of our life in the world, we become aware of divine being everywhere. When essential being becomes inward knowing, we feel a sudden change in ourselves, relaxed and free, full of strength and light. We are filled with a new and creative life. Those things that lie heavily upon us grow lighter. Problems which have been causing anxiety no longer oppress us, and events that in our ordinary state would plunge us into despair now lose their potency. Where every door seemed closed, all are now open. We, who in ourselves were poor, now feel rich. And in the midst of clamor, we are peaceful and calm. It is as though we were bathed in an invisible light which warms and shines upon us. We sense about us a radiance that shimmers through everything. But just as this radiance can dawn upon us without warning, so can it as suddenly disappear. We have no power to make it happen, nor to retain it once it is there. The most we can do is to learn to become prescient and aware of those attitudes which prepare us for such experiences, and also, of course, those which prevent them. The great lesson to be learned, when we are on the threshold of this process of transformation, is to recognize the vital importance of our inner experience, and to accept and admit to consciousness those moods and impulses through which greater being reveals itself. Transformation inescapably concerns not a part, but the whole person. The time has come for us to comprehend the full significance of this statement. It means that a man must value himself just as he does another person, in all his wholeness, depth, and unity, in a word, as a subject. Only then will he be able to work rightly at the twofold task of cleansing his inner life and correcting his external attitudes. When we have understood that body and psyche are not two separate entities, but merely two aspects of the whole way in which a person manifests himself, outwardly and inwardly, we come to understand that work on our inner being will inevitably affect the body, and that efforts to change the body will equally inevitably have their effect within. Mention should be made here of two attitudes which particularly prevent self-realization. They are hypertension and slackness. The one reveals a person entirely in the grip of an ego which has completely lost touch with the powers that dwell in the depths of being, and, because of this, is constantly concerned with its own security. The other discloses a person lacking in awareness and with a complete absence of any responsibility for that state which corresponds to essential being and is capable of revealing it. Just as hypertension and slackness hinder all recovery from physical illness, so do they obstruct man's self-realization and inner well-being. We all come to recognize, sooner or later, to what extent the constant swing between these two conditions prevents the formation of the center core that is so essential to our being. But once we are aware of the significance of such a realization, we cannot but strive to overcome these two great enemies of the right way of being. Where there is hypertension, we find that excessive self-will, persistent self-control, and constant surveillance by an all-too-watchful ego block the flow of the forces of divine being which, in accordance with their own laws, inevitably pursue their course in concealment. In order to be able to operate freely, these forces require from man a basic truthfulness which enables him to give himself confidently to the life-giving and liberating being which is present in his essence. All hypertension is an expression of a lack of trust in divine being. Slackness, on the other hand, is a sign that man has let himself go and therefore forfeited his inherent form. A man can never be correct without a certain degree of awareness of the responsibility he bears for his total appearance, or Gestaltgewissen. If he remains true to his conscience, it is impossible for him to be without form. The proper frame of mind will always reveal the combination of a trustful, passive attitude and an active attitude of individual responsibility. Most people have neither. Therefore, they lack the two most essential conditions for being in the right state of mind and body: transparency and true form. Man, as a person, embracing body and soul, develops and realizes himself in every gesture he makes. But his personality is revealed most particularly through posture, tension, and breathing. Nothing of what has been said, however, should be understood solely in a physical sense. Bad posture, wrong tension, and incorrect breathing are all different ways in which a person's impermeability and lack of form make their appearance. Thus, it is that we are able to assist into being this person who, while embracing body and soul, is beyond the contradiction of these apparent opposites. Man can be helped to tackle the task of setting himself to rights by the proper practice and right posture, right tension, and right breathing. It is the recognition of the need for this that opens up a field of possibility accessible to all, through which the daily round itself becomes practice. Practice that consists simply in learning how to be and how to behave in the world. Man's correct posture is always determined by the right center of gravity. The ingrained bad posture of many people is caused by the shifting of the center of gravity too far upwards. This can be seen in those who are dominated by the habit chest out, belly in, where the drawing up of the shoulders is always an indication of tension. When we come across such instances of incorrect posture, the reason is never solely physical, nor is it without importance. Indeed, it has great significance since it is a sign of arrogance and an overemphasis on one's own person. Such a posture is the defensive and protective mechanism of the man who is identified with his small ego, and who therefore seeks above all to safeguard himself and to hold secure his position in the world. Whenever a wrong posture has become deeply ingrained, it blocks the redeeming, renewing, and preserving forces that arise from the depths of being. The complementary form of this attitude, which is often seen to alternate with it, is that of collapsing, of giving way. In such a case, the innate image of man as an upright being is lost. Such dissolution is evidence of a lack of feeling for and responsibility towards the correct form without which essential being cannot manifest itself. Once, however, we become aware of the harmful effects of bad posture and consequently strive to develop and mature in accordance with our true nature, which means an unflagging search for the right center of gravity. We begin to perceive in ourselves certain far-reaching changes. We know without doubt that we are moving in the right direction. The Japanese have a special term for that part of the body which is the correct center of man. It is hara. The word hara, known to many through the expression harakiri, literally means belly. However, in its applied sense, it describes rather the general attitude of man in which, freed from his small ego, released from pride, from the desire to dominate, the fear of pain, the longing for security, he becomes firmly anchored in his true center. Thus centered, he is able to be receptive to the forces of being which, with or without his awareness, transform, support, shape, and protect him, while at the same time enabling him to reveal these forces to the world by the quality of his work, his ability to create, and his capacity for love. This effort to attain the correct center of gravity is the fundamental practice by means of which we are enabled to live in the world in the right way. Thus, resting in the basic center, we are relaxed and free, and at the same time feel ourselves supported. In the truest sense, here, we can be said to be upright. By means of this practice, the belly, the pelvis, and the small of the back and their relation to each other form the basis of correct posture. When all movement flows from this relaxed yet firm center, all gestures, attitudes, and postures, walking, standing, sitting, become, as it were, testimonies to true being. There is no aspect of daily life that does not provide opportunity for this practice. If, for one moment, we forget hara, whether it be in walking, standing, or sitting, we cease at that moment to be fully and personally present. When the upper part of the body, the ego area, becomes tense and rigid, this rigidity cuts off from our essence. On the other hand, when we sink downwards, dissolving into shapelessness, we lose the form which testifies to essential being. All those actions which require concentrated attention and willpower have the possibility of endangering our hold on the center and our presence in hara. Whenever we aspire towards some goal or being dominated by our worldly ego, we fix our attention on a particular objective. We are in danger of losing touch with our center. Indeed, every kind of work or activity which is aimed towards a definite end can be the means, unless we're deeply grounded in hara, of shifting the center of gravity too far upwards. If we keep this in mind, it will be seen that every action provides an opportunity to practice correct posture. Each moment contains for us the possibility of establishing and consolidating the attitude which frees us from the domination of our worldly ego and allows us to exist from our essential being. To the extent to which we succeed in this, whatever work we undertake will flow more easily. Our knowledge and skill will be fully at our disposal, our labors crowned with success, and, moreover, in relationships with people, we will be relaxed, uninhibited, and free. Tension and relaxation are two aspects of every living whole. We moderns, however, tend to swing backwards and forwards between the two mutually exclusive extremes of these aspects: hypertension and slackness. Even when we talk of relaxation, what we usually mean is nothing but complete dissolution, a condition which, a moment later, is inevitably transformed into a tension equally absolute. What has to be learned and constantly practiced is to relax without being slack. Correct relaxation induces the right kind of tension and has the effect of renewing us. The purpose of all true letting go is not some blissful condition where there is no tension at all, but rather a transformation by which a correct tension is achieved. It should be remembered that in this practice to achieve the right center, relaxation is never merely a physical or a technical exercise. It always implies a total transformation of the person. We need to learn to relax ourselves, not only our bodies, in the right way. This entails far more than a relaxation of the muscles. Dropping the shoulders and letting go of oneself in the drooping of the shoulders are two fundamentally different movements. The one is a technical exercise, which results that are merely external and have no lasting effect. The other transforms the whole person. Hypertension bears witness to the fact that we are captive to the world ego. Thus, it is essential, insofar as we are identified with our world ego, that we learn to let go, not only at those times when we are tense, frightened, up in the air, or defensively clinging to the upper part of our body, but at all times and in all places. This should be our primary concern. Whenever we manage to drop that ego which holds us fast in a state of hypertension, it will be noticed that a change in our whole person is brought about. Normally, we become aware of wrong tension only when we are troubled by physical hypertension. But it should be realized that hypertension of any kind is always a sign of a wrong attitude to life. We have to learn to let ourselves go, as well as our attitudes. Only then, and only gradually, will we become calm and composed. It is impossible for us to relinquish, without falling apart, the support we gain from tension in the upper part of the body, or the ego area, until we have learned to anchor ourselves elsewhere. In a word, in the right center. But that is not all. It should be remembered that the practice of right tension goes hand in hand with the practice of breathing. The inner significance of this practice of breathing would be missed if it is exclusively regarded as a bodily exercise whose sole purpose is to improve health and efficiency. When breathing means no more to us than the drawing in and letting out of the air, it is an indication that we have not understood that. In truth, it is the breath of greater life which penetrates us and all living things. It moves through man, giving him life as a threefold entity: soul, spirit, and body. By means of this breathing, man opens himself to greater life and closes himself again, gives himself away and again receives himself, loses himself and finds himself. When breathing is out of order, not merely the body, but the whole person is out of order. Every disturbance in breathing signifies a disturbance of the total person and has the effect of bearing man's way to himself. Wrong breathing impairs worldly efficiency, But what is more important, the deeply ingrained obstruction of essential being, which it reveals, affects the entire development. Continuous wrong breathing expresses a progressively strengthening inhibition of essential being. On the other hand, breathing that flows correctly indicates that the way is free for life to unfold out of essence. The most widespread fault in breathing is found when a man breathes not from his center but from the upper part of the body, so that the instinctive movement of the diaphragm is replaced by the activity of the chest muscles. In such a case, an unnatural ego breathing takes the place of that breathing which nature intended for us. This indicates that the man is consciously or unconsciously doing something which, if he were in harmony with his essential being, would happen automatically. Whenever incorrect breathing becomes habit, the process by which a man becomes a person is obstructed. Such wrong attitudes to breathing are intimately related to other aspects of the personality, to all those fundamental misconceptions that man allows to master him and hinder his essential development in all spheres. Throughout the centuries, man has invented many different kinds of breathing exercises that serve a variety of purposes. One may or may not agree on the question of their validity, but there is only one indisputable practice of breathing, and that has neither been invented nor discovered by man. It is an essential part of him, inborn and in accordance with his essential being, and consists simply in letting breathing happen. Such practice merely involves establishing, or rather, rediscovering the natural manner of breathing. This means that the breath should be allowed to flow outwards and inwards naturally in a rhythmic movements of giving and receiving. With regard to the wrong habits we acquired through the domination of the ego, which lead us involuntarily to resist the full exhalation and then too quickly to draw in the breath. The basic and most helpful practice of breathing consists mainly in allowing complete exhalation. If this is done, correct inhalation follows quite freely without any assistance. Let me repeat that in practice. Like that of relaxation should not be approached solely from the point of view of a physical exercise. With an exhalation of the breath, we should let go of ourselves trustfully and without reserve. When a man can allow his breath fully to follow out, it is evidence of his deep trust in life. Whereas those who restrain their breathing mistrust both life and themselves. Thus, as it was with the practice of right posture and right relaxation, so it is with the right of breathing. It is, above all, a question of letting go the clinging, self-protecting ego. This is the only way in which we can free ourselves from our exaggerated inhibitions and hypertension, and thus become receptive towards our essential being. In this union with being, it is possible for us to acquire the outer form which corresponds to our inner image. Man's happiness as a person depends on the fulfillment of his deepest longings. In these, he perceives divine being, striving to manifest itself through him. His most fundamental yearning is for something which, in his essential being, he really is, and is intended to be. His happiness therefore depends on the extent to which he is able to conform to his inner destiny. But such a consummation is only possible insofar as he freely fulfills this intention in his daily life. The world in which we live is not a veil of sorrows which separates us from the peaks of the divine. Rather, it is a bridge which unites us with those peaks. We need but penetrate the obscuring mists that lie between us, and consciousness and tear down the obstructing walls that bar our way. This necessitates living the ordinary day as practice. No special time needs set aside for this. Each moment is a summons calling us to recollect and prove ourselves. There is no activity serving whatever external purpose that does not contain an opportunity to dedicate ourselves more ardently to the search for truth. No matter what we are doing, walking, standing, or sitting, writing, speaking, or being silent, attacking something, or defending ourselves, helping or serving others, whatever the task, it is possible to carry it out with a posture and an attitude that will more and more establish the contact with being. We must learn to make use of these opportunities in the practice of the right gesture. That was the end of kind of like the first chapter. Very interesting.